Hello there. This video, I'm going to be talking about variable naming. And there's a few of these videos about variable naming. And this one, I'm going to talk about preserving context to avoid conceptual ambiguity. So before I go through examples, I want to give one kind of overall caveat, which is the longer the function is, the more critical it is to preserve context. And I have a couple of examples here to show you what I mean. So in this very short function right here, derive session path and give it some input. I generate a file name, and then I join it with parent directory to make the session path. Now, if I'm looking at this function and I saw something like fname here, that's just a temporary variable to get you to this session path. And so since session path preserves the notion of what you're doing, and this is just used very temporarily, it's okay. The trick is you want to make it so that when you're looking at your code, you don't have to constantly interrupt your flow by having to remind yourself what something means. Optimally, you'll be looking at code and you'll just read through it like code somebody else wrote. You'll read through it once and it reads like a book and it all makes sense. That's the best we can hope for. In a function this short, you're very unlikely to get confused by a generic name, fname, that doesn't include more context. And so that's okay. In these longer functions, it's not okay because we have different kinds of path. We have a scene path, and then we have a local scene path right here. And so you really do need that context in a longer function, especially if there's different kinds of paths, for example. But even if there isn't, if you get down here and down to the bottom, you're like, wait, what is this again? You have to look to where it was instantiated. That's just one more interruption in your flow. And one thing I forgot to say at the beginning of this video is that one way to look at taking care in naming variables and making your functions small is that that activity fits under the umbrella of the general concept of reducing your stress. Because all these little cognitive challenges that you hit, if you look at code that wasn't carefully produced, you're always going to have to interrupt your flow. And it's just going to make for a longer process and one that has more cognitive jumping around, which is going to increase your stress. Because if you're needing to get something done by a deadline and you have all this subtle turmoil all the time because you're having to fight this cognitive battle, that's what you don't want. And so you should be motivated to reduce your future stress by investing time to make your variable names as easy to comprehend as you can. All right. With that said, with this general caveat that all the examples I'm going to show you are more critical the longer the function is, I found myself just in the habit of almost always preserving context anyway, because it's just become a habit. So in this small function, I put session file name, even though it's a throwaway variable, just because it's just the way it flows out of me now. All right. So with that bit of context, let's look at some examples. Okay. Preserving context to avoid conceptual ambiguity. So here we have a function, get average temperature underscore fair. So this is an abbreviation for Fahrenheit, which is one of the scales we can use. It's either Fahrenheit or Celsius. So I'm setting this variable X here, and that pretty much throws away all the context from here. Let's use something a little bit better. Data. That's still a context-free variable. Let's see if we can do better. Info know better. Kind of an irony that a variable named info doesn't have any information in it, but we'll move on. Okay, so now we get average temperature fair and we set it to T. So at least T could stand for temperature, but I would not do this because T almost always stands for time. And that's a potential point of confusion. So let's go with something like temp. Okay, temperature and temp, that's pretty good, but temp can also mean temporary, and we're still losing some context. So temp Fahrenheit is better, but we've still lost average. So the best we can do here is for this function, if you take away the get, and look, we have three meaningful pieces here, and I abbreviate them, that gets us a variable that preserves all the context. There's no opportunity for confusion with this. So that's where I would land on something like this. Okay. In this next example, I have a function called getLastLine. So here I'm getting the last line from session path. And so this is session file last line. And I'm getting last line from scene state path. And so I have this scene state file last line. So since I have two different files in play, I really do have to have different prefixes here to keep things straight. But if there's only one file in play, with my preserve all context rule, I might say last line of file equals get last line. But if there's only one file in play that we're loading, and I took away that much context, I think that's okay, because the concept of the last line of something, I can't really think of any other context that could be confused with other than a file. So that's okay in my mind. Okay, in this example, we have some function that takes a requesting machine as an argument, and it computes somehow something called designated machine. So with these two, I would consider these to be at the same level of abstraction. There's a similar amount of information in these names: requesting machine, designated machine. Now, what I wouldn't want to do is something like this, where I have requesting machine and machine, because it will be confusing. So preserve context to keep the abstraction levels the same. Okay, this is an interesting one. Here I have a function called get abbrev scene type from file name, and I set it to scene type. Now I've lost the context here that it's an abbreviated scene type. So if my code base always uses an abbreviated scene type to capture the notion of scene type, it never uses another form, then I don't always want to have to say abbrev scene type everywhere. And the only time I would need to do that is if in my code in various places, I intermix different forms of scene type. For example, scene type full name might be one that gets used sometimes if I have to print something out. In my case, in the code base this came from, it was always abbreviated. So having the extra context every time I had that variable was not necessary. And so I was able to make this code tighter. Okay, another context loss situation I've seen in this first example here. We're applying XYZ to tree. So we pass in a tree and we apply X to the tree, and then we reset the variable tree to be the output of that. And then we do the same for apply Y. And so we are reusing this variable. And it is true, they are all trees, but it's losing context. So I highly recommend that we do what is happening here, where if you transform a tree with X, then you call it the X tree. You apply Y to X tree, that becomes Y tree. And that way If this was a long function, if this was enough lines and you just landed somewhere and you saw, if it was this case, if you saw tree somewhere, you wouldn't know which one it was. Here, it's unambiguous. Notice also that I'm choosing not to just say return apply z to tree, kind of like I did up here. And the reason I do that is because if I'm just glancing at this code and I know it's supposed to apply x, y, z, and I just see variables x and y and not a z, then I'll be distracted for a minute. Like, did I make the z? And oh yeah. And this has something to do with, maybe it's just me, but when I'm looking at code, I generally look at the left side of the statements as a process to understand the code. Okay, what's this variable? What's it set to? And then as I'm moving through, I read to the right and see what's going on. So a lot of times if I just glance at a function and I see the stuff happening on the left here, that's helpful. So I just added this in here like that. It's not a big cost to do that. Okay, so that's enough about preserving context. The next video will talk about variable names and visual clutter.